Good evening. Welcome to our Wednesday night service and the continuation of our summer series. Our speaker tonight is Ben Wright. Ben preaches at the Blackwater Macedonia congregation down in Walker County and has been there since 2019. Ben is a graduate of Amherst University as well as the Memphis School of Preaching. He and his wife Jency have been married for 22 years and they have 3 children, Braden, Blake, and Jenna. Many of you know Ben from Indian Creek Youth Camp, where he has been involved in the work down there for many years. Ben has a passion for youth, he has a passion for athletics, and he has a passion for preaching the gospel. Welcome, Ben Wright.
Thank you for allowing me to be a part of your summer series. It is very different, of course, not being there in person. Of course, 2020 has issued us a lot of new things and new ways to do things. And one thing for which I'm very thankful in our brotherhood is that we have used the power of social media, the power of the internet to get the gospel message out when people were quarantined. And this is just another way of doing that. I've heard of virtual gospel meetings, now virtual summer series. A friend of mine the other day told me the congregation where he preaches is having a virtual vacation Bible school. And so as long as we're meeting, as long as the word is getting preached, we'll come up with new ways to do that, I'm sure. And I'm thankful to be a part of this with you. I think so highly of the Meridianville congregation. I'm very thankful to Randy for allowing me the opportunity to speak, the elders for giving me this invitation. The theme is such a very important theme, the theme on the home. And for my topic tonight, I want us to look at communication in the home. In Proverbs chapter 18, there the Proverbs writer in verse 21 says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it shall eat the fruit thereof." I don't think this is any kind of new idea to us, but there's great power in our tongues. The words that we say. The old saying that sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me is a very false statement. Words are biting, words are hurting, words are stinging if used in those ways. They are also very uplifting. They are very powerful. They're very moving. They're loving when we use them in the correct way. And so death and life are in the power of the tongue. They that love it shall eat the fruit thereof. And so our tongues are powerful. But notice the very next verse, verse 22. "Whoso findeth a wife findeth a good thing, and obtaineth favor of the Lord." Notice in verse 21, he talks about the power of the tongue, and then he moves right into the husband and wife relationship. I believe that's very purposeful. Communication is a key to a happy home. In my study on this topic, and I'm no expert on communication, this is the material that I'm presenting to you this evening is material that I've gathered and tried to put together in a form that will help us be better communicators in the home. And in the course of my study, I found that research has shown that over 80% of problems in marriages stem from lack of communication between spouses. 80% of the problems in marriage. That's an extremely high number. If we could better communicate, we can cut down on the number of problems in a marriage. Marriage is hard enough as it is. That we need to make sure that our communication is the best that it can be to make it somewhat easier. Many times we just don't know how to communicate. Our conversations are not deep. We have problems opening up about our deep feelings and emotions to the ones with whom we share our lives. God created a lot of things there in Genesis chapter 1, didn't he? After each day, he'd say it was good. But after he created marriage on the 6th day, he said it is very good. God intended for marriages to last until death. And so when you take that idea that God said marriage is very good and that he intended for marriages to last till the death of one or both of the spouses, that means God intended for the two parties involved in the marriage along with him to communicate with one another. Now, God's done His part, His communicating part. He's given us the Bible. He speaks to us every day through nature, but He speaks to us specifically through His Word. We're to speak to Him through prayer, of course, but we also are joined together with a spouse, and we are to talk, to communicate with one another. You know, if you're like a lot of people, you may find communication confusing. There are at least 6 things that can be conveyed when you're trying to communicate something. What you think you're saying, what you meant to say, what you actually said. Those are first 3. Because a lot of times we think we're saying one thing, but we end up, we're really saying something else. There are things that we meant to say, and when we thought about it, it sounded good in our heads, but it didn't come out maybe the way that we want. And that just leads to what we actually say. But then you also, when you're communicating, you convey a message of what the other person says about what you said, then what the other person heard, and then what you think the other person said about what you said. And so there's a lot going on in a conversation. There's a lot going on when 2 people are communicating. And there are a lot of ways for those wires to get crossed, and for what you're trying to communicate to be misunderstood or to be misheard or to be misspoken. And so communication, good communication, takes great effort. A lot of times we send mixed messages when we're communicating with our wife, or a wife is communicating with her husband. We say one thing with our words, then we say something else, very possibly with the tone of our voice. And then a third thing we might be, a third way we communicate is with our gestures. I'm a handsy person. I talk with my hands a lot. I make gestures. Some people don't. But even by the way that we stand with our arms crossed or open, all those things communicate something, and it may be communicating something that we're not communicating with words. Every year, corporations spend lots of money training their employees to be effective communicators. They understand that their business does better when it is run by those who communicate well. We need to spend time learning to be better communicators in our homes. Our homes are vital. That's where our children first meet God. That is where we help one another get to God. That's where we help one another get to heaven. And so our home is extremely important. And so we need to be good communicators. There's a pattern that usually plays out when it comes to lack of communication leading to divorce. And if you look around, if Meridianville is anything like Blackwater, and like most congregations of which I'm aware, divorce has crept into the congregation. It happens. And there's a pattern that usually plays out when it comes to lack of communication leading to divorce. First of all, there's a problem that arises that gets left unresolved. This problem happens and you don't do anything to fix it. You just kind of sweep it under the rug or ignore it. But what happens then is that anger begins to deepen on one or both sides. There's this problem. It hasn't been resolved, so dad gets angry, mom gets angry, one or the other or both. Then when they have discussions about other things, because of what's unresolved, those conversations get heated. And again, there's still no resolution. And then despair sets in on both sides, and they just say, what's the use? It's not getting any better. And then this leads to one or both parties talking to someone else. Many times this someone else is not your preacher, not one of your elders, not a marriage counselor. Sadly, sometimes it's a person of the opposite sex, and then problems are increased, they're multiplied. In a marriage, each spouse has to have the right to freely and openly communicate. And this right needs to be exercised properly, but that right must be there. Because, as one writer stated, when loving communication stops, all other aspects of the marriage suffer. Do you want to have a good home life? You better communicate properly. As a married couple, do you want to have a good sexual life? You better communicate properly. That is vital to every aspect of the home. And so what we want to do in our sermon in this time tonight is discuss communication in marriage so that our marriages can be even greater sources of joy. First of all, notice barriers to communication. The first barrier is materialism. Whenever we put things before God, whatever it may be, any earthly thing that comes before God, it hurts our marriages. Our relationship with God affects our relationship with our spouse. Here, a Christian husband and a Christian wife, and one or both of them has allowed things of the world to come between them and God. Those things of the world, whether it be money or power or work or whatever you want to put there, when it comes before God, that relationship with God is affected, but then the husband and wife relationship is going to be affected as well. Many sadly think that by providing material goods that they're showing their love. In truth, we need to be verbal much more than material in the way we express our love for our spouses. Yes, we need to do things and give gifts, but we need to say words. But first of all, we've got to make sure our relationship with God is where it ought to be. Nothing is coming between us and God. In 1 Peter chapter 3, he says that the husband and wife need to have a good relationship, and we're going to notice this passage a little bit later, but he says, so that your prayers be not hindered. We want to have a good relationship. We've got to have open communication with God so that we can have open communication with our spouse. Another barrier to communication is a critical attitude. I read a psychologist who wrote an article about this. He said the major barrier to interpersonal communication is our very natural tendency to judge, evaluate, to approve or disapprove the statement of the other person. And oftentimes, when a spouse is saying something to us, we're critiquing what they're saying, whether we approve of it or not, is what we're deciding. And instead of listening and taking it in and being honest about it, we have a critical attitude. And that's going to put the one speaking on the defensive, because we've jumped on the defensive if we don't like it. Now, as in all things, we're to judge righteous judgment. John chapter 7, Jesus told us that. That's based on actions. And if our spouse has shown us by his or her actions that he or she loves us and they have our best interest at heart, why would we be critical when they try to share something with us that may be negative towards us? Because they only have our best interest in mind, but our critical attitude often gets in the way. Well, another barrier to communication is fear. If there is a lot of criticism when we do say something to our spouses, we get to be where we're afraid to open up to him or her. Because here I am, I'm telling you how I feel, and you're criticizing me. I don't want that. You don't want that in your marriage, and so what do? We stop talking. We stop communicating. Or maybe our spouse, if we do come with something negative we'd like him or her to work on in some aspect of the marriage or some aspect of his or her life, and they get angry with us because we've said something negative. We fear that anger, so we don't say anything. We don't communicate. Another barrier to communication is manipulation. Something is said, we whine, we pout, we maybe withhold our love, we withhold sex, we withhold the way we normally treat them in order to get our spouse to think the way we want them to think or to do what we want done. You see, that's manipulation. That's not right. No one likes to be manipulated. And we know when we are. And what happens when we are manipulated by a spouse, by someone that we love, it creates resentment and it creates distrust. And so manipulation is a barrier. Another barrier is preoccupation. What do we mean by that? If your home is anything like my home, at least before all this happened, it's beginning to get this way again, sadly. You've got things going on. You're busy. You've got this event, the children have their events, and your spouse has that event, and so everybody's going in a different direction, and we get caught up in the mundane instead of the important. What's important? My marriage, your marriage is important. It is one of the divine institutions created by God. The home is. And so it is very important. There's only three: the church, government, and the home. They've got to be important. We need to view them that way. And if I'm getting caught up, if you're getting caught up in the mundane things of life and to the neglect of that which is important, we're going to hurt our homes. And none of us really want to do that. Our spouses, my wife, your spouse, your husband, your wife, they need to know that they have our attention. Another barrier that we find in communication in the home is dullness. Sometimes we let our marriages get stuck in ruts. Everything stays the same. Have you ever been in a worship service and one of the brethren there is called on to lead a prayer, and before he gets up to pray, you can say the words that he's going to say because he said that prayer so many times? That happens at times. That also happens with our words at home. We say the same things over and over again. We eat the same foods. We wear our same favorite clothes. We go to the same places every time. Nothing's ever new. Nothing is ever exciting. And we get in these ruts. Happy couples look for new things to do together. And they talk about those things that they would like to do. And they're not shot down when those new things are suggested. Dullness is a barrier to communication. If I say the same things and I get the same response every time, that becomes dull. It becomes boring. And that's when people get a wandering eye, trying to find excitement somewhere else. The last barrier that we'll notice under this point is dishonesty. We have to be so open with our spouses. And we're going to talk about that even more in another point. But dishonesty ruins relationships. It ruins marriages. It ruins friendships. It ruins a parent-child relationship. The trust that's got to be there that has to be there, that's so vital in a marriage, it's thwarted with even the smallest of untruths being noticed. There's a reason the Holy Spirit had Paul inspired to write, "Lie not one to another." Lies hurt, lies kill, lies destroy marriage. And when someone is dishonest, their spouse, his or her spouse, is not going to communicate because they're not going to believe what's being told them back. They're not going to believe the motives. They're not going to believe the actions even. And so dishonesty is a barrier to good home communication. Well, those are some barriers. Those are things that are there that can creep into our marriages. And they're things for which we need to be looking and make sure that we root them out. Don't let them get into our marriages and block them. But secondly, notice some keys to effective communication. We mentioned 1 Peter 3:7 earlier, but this key here that we find is that we need to be knowledgeable. Notice what Peter was inspired to write there in 1 Peter 3:7. "Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with your wives, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, not mentally, emotionally, but physically weaker. And as being heirs together of the grace of life," notice, "that your prayers be not hindered." Husbands, we ought to know the likes and dislikes of our wives. And the same thing is true for wives, but generally they pick up on those things a lot more quickly than the male species does. But we need to know what color she likes. We need to know what type of food she likes. We need to know the places that she likes to go, the things she likes to do, the TV shows she likes to watch. All those type of things. But the only way that happens is by spending time with her and communicating, talking, listening to what she's saying, being engaged in those conversations. So if we want to effectively communicate with our spouses, we need to be knowledgeable about them. We need to be loving. Secondly, you and I cannot render evil for evil. We've got to be loving even when our spouse is not loving. There in the context of 1 Peter chapter 3, he's talking about wives winning their husbands to Christ. He doesn't say it by nagging. He doesn't say it by preaching. It says there in that passage, it talks about the good heart, the good actions that will lead to the conversion of the spouse. Notice they may, without the word, verse 1, be won by the conversation, the manner of life of the wives. The way that you and I live has an effect on our spouse. If we have a spouse that is not a Christian, and we're constantly nagging, we're constantly harping, we're preaching to them, and we're always on them about different things, we're not going to win him or her to Christ. If we want our spouse to be loving towards us, we've got to be loving. We've got to reach out and help, even when they're not wanting us to maybe seemingly reach out to them. We've got to be loving. A third key to effective communication is that we need to be transparent. Nothing ought to be hidden from our spouse. If your spouse or my spouse is to deeply love, he or she must deeply know you. Again, knowledgeable goes back to that first point. There is no room in this relationship for what he or she doesn't know won't hurt them. There's no room for that. In this social media age in which we're living, it's very easy to hide things from our spouses? Very easy. We can have those hidden folders on our phone. When we go to well, they won't see it, see that app, whatever app it may be that we're trying to hide. Or maybe we do things on social media and we've got some other page that is not under our name, but we use it. Really, if we've got something password protected, my spouse needs to know the password. Our phone locks ought to be known by our spouses. If your spouse picks up your phone to look at it, you shouldn't have to cringe and think, oh, I hope they don't see that, because if I do, that's a problem. Which leads us to the next key, is that we need to be trustworthy. My wife ought to be able to place all of her trust in me. She did when she said I do, didn't she? Same for your spouse. Now, of course, I'm human. I've let her down. You've let your spouse down. But hopefully we've done nothing that would damage the trust that our spouses have placed in us. But when we lie, when we hide things, we're showing ourselves to be untrustworthy. And if I want to be able to effectively communicate, if I want to be able to get a point across to my wife, or you want to get a point across to your spouse, if there's no trust there, that point's not going to be made. Another key is that we need to be positive. If we're constantly negative, if we're always harping, as we mentioned earlier, about trying to convert someone, but even about other things, if we're constantly negative, the way we approach an issue, it's going to be tuned out. If something is unimportant, let's learn to just leave it alone. If it's not going to be something that really has a big effect, let's learn to leave it alone. But another key is that we need to be sensitive. Just because we would not feel a certain way about something does not mean our spouse won't feel a certain way. There are things that I can deal with that my wife simply can't deal with. She can't tolerate it. She gets angry, or maybe it's something that hurts her, and to me, it's nothing. And I think, why in the world is this bothering you? It's because we're different. And I'm thankful for the differences. And so when something does, or has in the past, shown to be bothersome to my wife, I need to be very cognizant of that. Dwell with them according to knowledge. We need to be accepting of our spouse's feelings and help them deal with those feelings. Not tell them they're dumb or they're stupid for feeling that way. Oh, that's just crazy. No, not to them, it's not. And we need to understand that. Then you might think, well, what in the world? This is the main point, but we need to be effective communicators. And by that I mean, there are times in a conversation, you're talking with someone, your spouse or whomever, and you see by the look that they're giving you or some gesture they make, that they don't understand what you're saying. I've been there on both ends. As an effective communicator, I've got to realize when the one to whom I'm speaking is not getting what I'm saying. You think about it this way. If you're sitting in a Bible study with someone, and obviously by what the look on their face, they're not comprehending what you're saying. Do you just keep going on? No. You go back to that point and you stay there until they understand it. You don't get upset with them. We know not to do that in a Bible study, don't we? why is it any different with our spouses? Let's make sure that they understand. And we do so in a loving way. Then another key, which for me, and this may be the hardest one, is that we need to be good listeners. How many times do you read Jesus having said, "He that hath ears to hear, let him hear"? Most people on earth are born with ears. Sadly, I know there are some that have hearing problems. But we understand what Jesus is saying there, don't we? He's not saying you hear it. He's saying make sure that you're listening to what's being said. Listen to the words that are coming out of my mouth so that you can understand them. A problem with a lot of our conversations is that by the time they get about halfway through a statement, we're already trying to figure out how we're going to answer that statement, and we stop listening to what is then being said. We need to listen to everything that's being said first. Then come with our answer. We need to be good listeners. But also, lastly, in this key to effective communication, is we need to be prayerful. Have you ever stopped in the middle of an argument that you're having with your spouse and said, "Hey, we need to pray about this"? Or at least in your mind, you're saying a prayer to help you have a good attitude. You know, it's really hard to argue with someone for whom you're praying. And this can happen in any setting. I was in a preacher's elders meeting, and it was getting heated. And I said, "Brethren, we need to stop and have a prayer." We need to be prayerful. We're going to calm down at that point. And it's going to help us to remember how we are to treat the one with whom we're communicating. Now, those are some keys. We want to be good communicators. If we can instill these in our communication abilities, we're going to be much better communicators. But there are going to be times when we argue. It happens. The men that were closest to Jesus, the apostles, they argued with one another. We're going to argue from time to time. Well, we want to notice, thirdly and finally, how to fight fairly. Because we're going to fight at times, or if you want to say, we're going to have loud discussions at times, however you term it in your home. It's going to happen. What's the best way to do it? Well, first of all, we need to clarify the issue. We need to make sure that we are discussing the same thing. You know, a lot of times we'll argue, but it's two different things going on about which we're arguing, because we're not listening to one another. And if we would stop and listen, and here's this issue, and you think, well, that's not what I'm talking about. I agree with what you're saying on that. Now listen to what I'm saying about this. We need to make sure that we're clear, the issue is clarified, that each of us know exactly what's being discussed. Secondly, when you're trying to fight fairly, when I'm trying to fight fairly, repeat the words that have been said to you. How many times have you been arguing with your wife or with your husband, and you say, or anybody for that matter, and you say, "That's not what I said"? We need to make ourselves understand exactly what the other person is saying. So if I understand you right, wife, you want me to put the toilet lid seat down. Is that exactly what you're saying? That's how we need to be. We need to make sure that we are understanding exactly what our spouse is saying. A third way to fight fairly is to choose the right time. Don't ambush your spouse with an argument. Your spouse walks in, whether it be the husband or the wife, they've been at work, and they are ready to kind of unwind, and you jump on them about something they did or something that's going on, and it's an argument right out of the gate. That's not a good time. Right before you go to bed is not a good time to argue. You need to say, hey, in a few minutes, I need to talk to you about something, and it's very important. Don't just ambush your wife with something or your husband. Another way to fight fairly is look before you leap. Will arguing about this topic bring about any good? The Proverbs writer said, the beginning of strife is as when one letteth out water. Therefore leave off contention before it be meddled with. There's some things that if we would really think about, they're not important. They're not going to bring about any good. And I, as a person, I really need to just get over it. Because it's not that big a deal in the long run. And we need to be aware of that. There are some things that are very, very important. But there's some things that aren't. And the way we approach those things that are and those things that aren't ought to be very different. So we need to look before we leap. A fifth way to fight fairly is we resolve to resolve. What does that mean? We are never going to end an argument, a loud discussion, without the matter being resolved. In Ephesians chapter 4, be ye angry and sin not, but notice, let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Then the very next verse says, neither give place to the devil. You see, if we allow things to fester, we're allowing the devil some room to operate. If we're going to have a discussion, my wife and I are going to have an argument, we're going to finish it. And it's going to be resolved. And we're going to leave that discussion when we're both satisfied that it's been finished and it's complete and there's nothing else to discuss about it. And that the one who had the problem is now resolved. But when we're doing that, a sixth way to fight fairly is that we need to attack the problem, not our spouse. It's an election year, and there is already plenty of mudslinging going on. Husbands and wives, leave that to the politicians. As someone said, before too long, a rock gets thrown in with the mud. We need to find out what the problem is, and when we are talking, we are addressing the problem, not our spouse. We need to make sure that we're speaking, even if we're angry, in ways that are not hurtful, that are not harmful. But we're addressing the problem. And then lastly, I don't know if you can do this, I don't know if we can do this in my house. But hold hands while you're arguing. The one that I saw this rule, what they said about it is that it's very difficult to verbally assault your spouse while holding his or her hand. And I imagine that's very true. And then the writer said, don't let go of that hand until you pray. Effective communication. Truly talking about things, truly listening, can make our marriages greater. Remember, God looked at that marriage relationship and He said, it's very good. That's what He wants for your marriage. That's the model. And it can be. We're going to be happier. I'm going to be a happier husband. My wife is going to be a happier wife. And the same in your home. When each of us can be open and be able to discuss anything. We ought to realize that really many of the things that we argue about have something lying deeper that really needs to be fixed. And then we need to work on those problems. Someone said we argue over the spider web, but we really need to get rid of the spider. And I believe that to be very true. There's a great deal of material out there to help your homes now with this, the social media aspect. Just in the last year, I've been introduced to a Christian couple. I think their Twitter page is Trey and Lee's Habits of a Stronger Marriage or something along those lines. And they go around the country and they do seminars as a couple, helping couples have happier marriages. Something I saw just the other day is that 10% of the problems that we have are what we say. 90% of them are how we say them. Again, communicating. Let's make sure that what we're saying is right, is good, and in the right tone. But let me tell you right now, one of the greatest aids in your home, for your marriage, and in my home, for my marriage, is for husband and wife to be Christians. Truly striving to put God first. Both truly striving to live for the Lord so that heaven can be the home of both of them, and if they are blessed with children, even to introduce heaven to their children. If we're not New Testament Christians, that is already a hard thing to handle in a marriage. Let's make sure that we're New Testament Christians and then that we're faithful New Testament Christians. When we truly are, we're going to love God, which means we're going to love our spouses. And we'll do whatever we have to do to communicate properly with them. Again, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of your summer series. And may God bless each of us as we strive to have homes that are pleasing to Him.
Thank you, Ben. Before we dismiss, let us go to God in prayer. Father, we thank you for the day that we've had. We're thankful for the time that we've been able to come together and learn about your word. We're thankful for the lesson that Ben brought us and his knowledge. Father, we're thankful for the gospel and the fact that we can continue to learn how to be better Christians in this world. Father, help us not to worry. Help the leaders of this world figure out how to do things better. Help them to be unified and help them to get along. Father, we're thankful for your Son who died for us, and we know that our hope is in Him and in you. It's in your name, your Son's name, that we pray. Amen. Again, we thank Ben for being with us tonight. We thank all you for joining us. Please remember to continue to pray for our sick and those who are still being forced to be at home because of the pandemic. We're thankful of them, and we remember you guys. You're on our minds. We want to remind you that we worship Sunday morning at 10 a.m., Sunday afternoon at 5 p.m., and we have the summer series online here on Wednesday nights. Also, we have a Bible class that releases at 3 p.m. on Sunday afternoon, and we're studying 1 and 2 Timothy. Thank you for joining us, and have a good evening.